Ireland has a complicated history with James Joyce. Even this centre is 40 years old, and I think was quite radical when it was developed as a James Joyce Center, because really there was a sense of shame about his writing. A lot of his family still lived, his sisters, his cousins still lived in the city. There's stories about aunts getting a copy of Ulysses and burning it because they didn't want this dirty book, this obscene book in their house. There was a very definite sense of shame and not knowing how to deal with Joyce as a writer. They knew he was getting international acclaim for his work, but really they felt his description of the Catholic Church, of bodily function, of Molly Bloom being so overtly sexual, Gertie McDowell on Sandymount Strand, women exposing their legs to a man. Really the Irish public in the whole history of Ulysses, right up maybe till, I would say maybe nearly the 1990s, when things began to change in an Irish society. Joyce was the oldest of 10 children, not so uncommon at that time in Ireland. And the family began life quite well off, very middle class, lived in a big home in the south of Dublin. Life was good at the beginning. Yeah. They had money, they had a big home. Young James Joyce was sent to an elite boarding school at only 6 years old. He was considered a very clever, intelligent child, would sing at concerts with his parents. They were both good singers, and I think that was a lovely connection between the three of them, actually, in the early days of the family. John Stanislaus Joyce, Joyce's father, started off with lots of money. He inherited money from his family. He owned property, but it meant he had little regard for money, and he drank a lot. So family life became very difficult for the Joyce family. By age 11, when Joyce was just 11 years old, the family was sliding into poverty. They had to sell off the property. They were renting poor houses in less well-off areas. He had to be removed from the elite school. They could no longer afford to pay the fees for that. So they moved into this area in the north inner city in Dublin. And really, the family began a period of time between the ages of 11 and 22 for James Joyce, where they moved 14 times, constant eviction, they couldn't pay rent, this fracture and chaos in his adolescent life, and really became really tragic with the death of his mother when Joyce was only 21 years old. And they would have had a really beautiful relationship. They would have sung together. She played piano. Joyce loved entertaining and dressing up, performing songs from the theatre or music halls. So I love to think about the good times when they really had a beautiful, happy relationship. Of course, the opposite of that is documented in Portrait of the Artist, where the violence of his father is revealed through the character, of course, of Stephen Dedalus, the alter ego of James Joyce. And really this is the chaotic world that the young James Joyce had to leave. Dublin was not a good place for him to stay in for all kinds of reasons. His rejection of the Catholic Church, of societal rules, but also, I think, family life was really difficult. This is the door of number 7 Eccles Street, which is one of the most famous literary addresses of all time. We're really lucky to have this door. It was saved when the actual building was being demolished, and they managed to save the door. And we've had lots of people from all over the world coming, almost like a pilgrimage, to touch the door and make a wish and be like Leopold Bloom. Of course, this is where Leopold begins and ends his journey. So instead of Ulysses traveling around the Mediterranean for 20 years, we have Leopold Bloom traveling through Dublin city just on one day, the 16th of June, 1904. This was the door of his real friend, who Joyce came to visit on one of his very few visits back to Dublin. Joyce left in 1904 with his real girlfriend, Nora Barnacle. He was only 22, and he never again lived in Ireland, even though he wrote about Dublin and about Ireland throughout his career. Pretty much all his work is about this city, but he never again lived here. Really, just in the last few years, people have recognized how important Nora was to Joyce's writing, and really celebrating her as a person in her own right, rather than just the wife of a great genius. She was from Galway in the west of Ireland, was really quite wild and exciting as a teenager. There's stories of her dressing up as a boy to get into places and have adventures. And she came to work in Dublin in a hotel. Yep, the hotel is still, the building is still there, Finn's Hotel. And she met this Irish guy, but she thought he didn't look Irish. She thought he was a Norwegian sailor. So she was kind of interested. Who is this guy with his beautiful blue eyes and his sailor's hat? Of course, he was James Joyce. And she was excited by his writing of his letters to her and his little postcards and his singing. We are surrounded by one of the festivals that Joyce sang in, but one of the ways that he won her heart was to sing for her. So they met June 16th, 1904, and that is the day that Joyce celebrates in his book Ulysses, the first day that their first date, the first romantic date that they had together. I've been really fortunate with engaging with an exhibition that was first put on in the Ransom Center in Austin, in Texas, in the USA. And we were lucky enough to work with the curator of that exhibition, Professor Claire Hutton. And she really has been really thoughtful in thinking about all these women who have supported Joyce in creating Ulysses, and actually all of his work. So everyone from Sylvia Beach, who ran the Shakespeare & Co. bookshop in Paris, and this really, simple American woman who had this English-speaking bookshop and was brave enough to take on this crazy Irish writer and say, I will publish your book, when no one else would take it on. And then there's other women like Harriet Weaver, also a publisher, but in the UK, another fiercely brave woman who was publishing all kinds of writers, Ezra Pound, for example, and really believed in giving people a voice, no matter what their voice was, really non-judgmental. But she was quite wealthy, and she supported Joyce financially throughout his whole life, and even his daughter's life. Joyce had died and she still funded Lucia's care. She was in a sanatorium in the UK, and she continued to really, she was feeding the family. Her money was allowing Joyce to work. Claire has also thought about other women, you know, smaller characters in his world. His aunt Josephine, that was in Dublin, that he adored, this aunt, and he would write letters. So, you know, what shop is beside, you know, the statue of Daniel O'Connell in town, or tell me, you know, how many steps are down to the sea in Sandymount Strand. He wanted to get such a clear picture of Dublin, even though he was in exile or outside of Dublin. So yeah, these incredible people, that women mainly, that were supporting Joyce in his work. Especially this year, for 100 years, we're celebrating 100 years of this book. And so many people have asked me that as well, why is this book still important? And I've really had to think about, you know, well, why are we still reading this book all around the world and in Ireland? And lots of people for the first time, because of this celebration, are becoming brave and saying, okay, I'm going to read this. But I've really thought about this and thought, really we're understanding a lot of what Joyce was telling us 100 years ago. We're only learning about these things now, particularly in terms of kind of politics, gender politics, cultural politics. Ireland is 100 years old as a state this year as well, and I think we are growing up with this book. To me, it's one of the most beautiful pieces of writing in all of literature. Oh, and the sea crimsons sometimes like fire, and the glorious sunsets and the fig trees in the Alameda Gardens, yes. And all the queer little streets, and the pink and the blue and yellow houses, and the rose gardens and the jessamine and the geraniums and cactuses, and Gibraltar as a girl, where I was a flower of the mountain, yes. When I put a rose in my hair like the Andalusian girls used to, shall I wear a red? Yes. And how he kissed me under the Moorish wall, and I thought, well, as well him as another. And then I asked him with my eyes to ask again, yes. And then he asked me, would I, yes, to say yes, my mountain flower, and first I put my arms around him, yes, and drew him down to me so he could feel my breasts all perfume, yes. And his heart was going like mad. And yes, I said, yes, I will, yes.